The bullies had no idea who they were messing with. To them, he was just another quiet kid. Someone who wouldn't fight back. Someone they could push around for their own amusement. But what they didn't realize was that Luca Romano wasn't just any student. He wasn't weak. He wasn't helpless. And he definitely wasn't someone they should have picked on. Because behind his calm, reserved demeanor lay a truth far more dangerous than they could ever imagine. Jason and his gang thought they ruled the school. They thought they could humiliate him, break him down, and walk away without consequences. They thought they were invincible. But they were about to learn a lesson they would never forget. What happens when a group of high school bullies cross the wrong kid? Stay tuned. You won't believe how this story unfolds. Before we dive in, comment where you're watching from and subscribe for more gripping stories. Luca stood there, staring at the food smeared across his shirt. The cafeteria buzzed with laughter, the sound echoing off the walls. Jason leaned back, satisfied with himself, flashing his usual smug grin. To him, Luca was just another kid who wouldn't fight back, another weakling he could walk all over. He had no idea how wrong he was. Without a word, Luca picked up his tray, wiped his hands, and calmly walked out of the cafeteria. He didn't glare at Jason, didn't show anger, just silence. To everyone watching, it looked like he had surrendered. Jason and his gang laughed harder, thinking they had won. But to Ava, Luca's closest friend, something about his reaction felt off. Ava had known Luca since the first day of school. While others ignored him, sensing that he was different, she was drawn to his quiet confidence. He wasn't shy or afraid. He simply observed, listened, and stayed out of trouble. It was almost as if he was always holding himself back. What most people didn't know was that Luca Romano wasn't just any student. He was the son of Alessandro Romano, a man whose name was spoken in hushed tones, a mafia boss feared by many. But unlike his father, Luca wanted a different life. He didn't want power, violence, or fear. He wanted to be normal. That's why he never fought back, why he let Jason's insults slide. Jason, however, was the kind of person who fed off dominance. He wasn't just a bully. He was someone who needed control over others. He was the son of a wealthy businessman, used to getting whatever he wanted. His favorite game was picking out the quiet ones, the ones who wouldn't fight back, and making their lives miserable. To him, Luca was the perfect target. For weeks, Jason had been testing him, pushing him. First, it was small things, tripping him in the hallway, knocking his books to the floor. When Luca ignored him, Jason escalated. He and his gang trashed Luca's locker, spread rumors, and even stole his homework. Through it all, Luca remained silent. One afternoon, Ava finally confronted him. "Why do you let him do this to you?" she asked as they sat under a tree outside. Luca exhaled, staring at the sky. "Because it doesn't matter," Ava frowned. "It will if you let it continue. He thinks you're weak, Luca, and people like Jason, they don't stop until they're forced to." Luca knew she was right. He had been raised with strict discipline. His father always told him, "Power isn't about proving yourself. It's about knowing when to act." Luca didn't want to use the lessons he had been taught, but Jason was making it harder and harder to ignore him. Then, one day, Jason made the biggest mistake of his life. It happened after school, when most students had already left. Luca was at his locker, retrieving his things, when he heard the mocking voice behind him. "Well, well, if it isn't our favorite punching bag." Luca turned to find Jason and his gang standing there, blocking the hallway. But this time, Jason wasn't just here to talk. He held something in his hand, a small silver pendant. Luca's heart stopped. It was his mother's pendant, the only thing he had left of her. Jason dangled it carelessly, inspecting it under the dim light. "Didn't know you were the sentimental type, Romano," he said, turning the pendant over between his fingers. His smirk grew. "Wonder how much I can sell this for." Luca's hands clenched at his sides. His usual calm expression faded, his jaw tightening. The hallway, once filled with murmurs and footsteps, suddenly felt suffocatingly silent. Ava had just turned the corner when she saw the scene. Her breath hitched as she took in Luca's stance, the way his shoulders squared, the way his entire body seemed different. Jason, completely unaware of the danger he was in, tossed the pendant into the air before catching it again. "Come on, rich boy. If it means that much to you, take it back." Luca didn't move at first. His gaze was locked on the pendant, his breathing slow and measured. Ava swallowed. She had never seen him like this before. Luca wasn't scared. He was furious. Jason had just crossed a line he never should have. And soon, he would realize exactly who he had been messing with. Luca stared at the broken chain in Jason's hand, his mother's pendant dangling lifelessly between his fingers. The cafeteria had been filled with laughter minutes ago, but now an eerie silence swallowed the hallway. Jason grinned, expecting Luca to react, to lunge at him in blind rage. But Luca didn't move. He didn't yell or threaten. He just stood there, completely still, his dark eyes fixed on Jason with an expression that sent an unexplainable chill through the air. Jason, oblivious to the storm he had just unleashed, scoffed, "You want it back? Come and get it." His voice, once dripping with arrogance, now carried an edge of uncertainty. Before he could blink, Luca's hand shot forward, gripping his wrist like iron. Jason winced, caught off guard by the strength in Luca's grasp. "Let go!" Jason hissed, trying to yank himself free, but Luca's fingers only tightened, his voice dangerously quiet. "You don't understand what you've done." For the first time, Jason saw something in Luca's gaze that made his stomach twist. An intensity, a depth of control that didn't come from schoolyard fights or playground bravado. It was something much, much worse. Jason tried to step back, but Luca's grip remained unyielding. The onlookers, Jason's friends, Ava, the other students, held their breath, sensing the shift in power. Jason, the school's untouchable king, was suddenly at the mercy of someone he had underestimated. Luca released him with a small push, making Jason stumble. The pendant fell to the floor with a soft clink. Jason, humiliated and seething, clenched his fists and lunged forward, swinging wildly. But Luca was ready. In one fluid motion, he sidestepped, grabbed Jason's arm, and redirected his momentum. Jason lost his balance, crashing against the lockers with a loud thud. His friends took a step back, exchanging uneasy glances. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Jason wasn't supposed to lose. Jason groaned, pushing himself up, his face red with fury. "You think you're tough, Romano?" His voice wavered, but he refused to back down. His friends, hesitating at first, tried to surround Luca, but he remained still, his expression unreadable. Jason charged again, but this time Luca barely had to move. He sidestepped, extended his legs slightly, and Jason tumbled forward, landing hard on the floor. Murmurs spread through the hallway. The feared bully was being humiliated, not with fists, but with precision. Luca wasn't fighting wildly. He was controlling every move, effortlessly dismantling Jason without even breaking a sweat. Ava, sensing the situation spiraling, stepped forward. "Enough," she said firmly, looking at Jason. "Just stop." Jason's face twisted with frustration, but he could feel it. He had already lost. Luca bent down, picked up the broken pendant, and placed it gently in his pocket. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Jason stood there, fists trembling, eyes burning with shame. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. But as he watched Luca disappear down the hallway, a sickening realization settled in his gut. He had picked the wrong person to mess with. And deep down, for the first time in his life, Jason felt something he had never experienced before. Fear. Jason stood there, fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. But the weight of humiliation settled deeper than the sting on his wrist. He had always been the one in control, the one who decided who suffered and who didn't. Yet, for the first time, someone had turned the tables on him, effortlessly. Luca hadn't yelled, hadn't thrown wild punches, hadn't even looked remotely angry. No, the way he had handled Jason was something entirely different. It wasn't a fight, it was a lesson. A lesson that Jason wasn't ready to accept. The students in the hallway had seen it, the shift in power, the way Luca had walked away unbothered, as if Jason was nothing more than a small inconvenience. It made his blood boil. He couldn't let it end like this. He refused to let Luca walk around thinking he had won. His pride, his reputation, everything was at stake. If he couldn't break Luca in front of everyone, then he'd do it in the shadows. A slow smirk curled at the edge of his lips as an idea formed in his mind, one that would wipe away the shame he had just endured. If Luca thought he could walk away, Jason would make sure he regretted ever crossing him. The next day, Jason put his plan into motion. He and his gang skipped the usual public humiliation tactics. No tripping Luca in the hallway, no stolen books, no snide comments. Instead, they waited. They watched. Luca was predictable, always following the same path home, taking the shortcut behind the school parking lot, where the teacher's surveillance ended and the streetlights barely flickered to life. It was the perfect spot. No one would see what happened, and by the time Luca realized he had walked into a trap, it would be too late. Jason and his gang waited, their bodies tense with anticipation. The moment Luca stepped into the alley, Jason emerged from the shadows, his gang forming a tight circle behind him. The air was thick with tension, the scent of pavement and gasoline lingering in the damp alley. Jason cracked his knuckles, stepping forward. "Think you're tough, huh?" he sneered, his voice sharper than he intended. "Let's see how tough you are when it's not one-on-one." His gang moved in closer, creating a barrier around Luca, cutting off any escape. But Luca didn't react the way Jason had expected. There was no flicker of panic, no hesitation. If anything, he looked bored, as if he had already anticipated this exact situation. He exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders, his posture relaxed but calculated. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Luca asked, his voice eerily calm. A few of Jason's friends exchanged glances, momentary uncertainty flashing in their eyes. Jason felt it too, that small, nagging feeling in his gut that told him something was off. But he shoved it down, forcing himself forward. "You think you're better than me?" Jason growled before swinging, aiming a punch straight for Luca's face. It should have landed. It was fast, strong, fueled by days of bottled-up anger. But it never connected. In the blink of an eye, Luca shifted. He caught Jason's wrist midair, his grip like iron, and twisted, just enough for Jason to feel a sharp jolt of pain, but not enough to break anything. Jason's eyes widened in shock. Before he could recover, Luca let go, stepping aside in one fluid motion, causing Jason to stumble forward. One of Jason's friends, seeing their leader falter, rushed at Luca, determined to take him down. But Luca was faster. He ducked under the swing, grabbed the back of the guy's hoodie, and pulled. The momentum sent the attacker sprawling to the ground, landing hard with a grunt. The second guy tried to charge, but Luca sidestepped smoothly and struck, his elbow connecting sharply with the ribs, forcing a pained gasp from the bully as he doubled over. The remaining two hesitated, no longer as confident as they had been moments ago. Jason pushed himself up, panting, his eyes filled with disbelief. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Luca wasn't just defending himself. He was dismantling them with a level of control that none of them had ever seen. Luca adjusted his jacket, his expression unreadable. He hadn't broken a sweat, hadn't even looked strained. He met Jason's gaze and took a single step forward. Jason instinctively took a step back. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but Luca saw it. So did everyone else. Jason felt his face burn with shame. Luca didn't need to say a word. His silence was louder than anything Jason had ever heard. His gang had seen the shift, the way their leader had been reduced to nothing more than a desperate kid trying to hold on to his crumbling power. The humiliation, the realization of how outmatched he truly was, settled deep into Jason's gut like a heavy stone. Luca bent down, picked up the broken pendant Jason had tossed aside, and slipped it into his pocket. His voice was quiet but firm when he finally spoke. "Walk away." It wasn't a threat. It was a warning. Jason's throat tightened, but he said nothing. His fists trembled at his sides, but he knew, deep down, that this fight was over. And the worst part, Luca had won without even trying. As Luca turned and walked away, Jason remained standing in the dimly lit alley, his chest heaving, his world spinning. He had picked the wrong person to mess with, and for the first time in his life, Jason felt something foreign coil in his gut. Fear. Jason remained frozen in place, his fists clenched so tightly that his nails dug into his palms. He had never felt this way before, defeated, powerless. Luca's footsteps echoed in the alley as he walked away, each step reminding Jason of just how badly he had lost. His gang stood in awkward silence, exchanging uncertain glances. No one spoke. No one knew what to say. They had always seen Jason as untouchable, the one who dictated the rules of the school. But tonight, they had witnessed something different. Luca hadn't just beaten Jason. He had done it effortlessly, calmly, like someone who had been trained for situations far worse than this. Jason's chest heaved as he sucked in a sharp breath, his mind racing. This couldn't be how it ended. He couldn't just let Luca walk away like nothing had happened. His pride, his reputation, it was slipping through his fingers. And then, like a drowning man grasping at straws, he made a desperate decision. "You think this is over?" Jason spat, his voice hoarse, but still laced with arrogance. His words made Luca stop. Slowly, he turned back, his gaze meeting Jason's. There was no emotion in Luca's eyes, no anger, no amusement, just cold calculation. Jason swallowed, but he forced himself to stand taller, his ego clinging to whatever false confidence he had left. "You're not better than me," Jason continued, stepping forward despite the dull ache in his ribs. "You're just another rich kid who thinks he's untouchable. But you're not. You don't belong here. No matter how tough you act, you'll never be one of us." His words were meant to sting, meant to break through whatever wall Luca had built around himself. But Luca's face remained unreadable. Then, after a long pause, he took a step forward. Jason's breath hitched. Luca's voice was low, controlled. "I never wanted to belong." The words sent a shiver down Jason's spine. There was something chilling about how matter-of-fact Luca sounded, as if he had already decided that Jason was beneath him. Jason clenched his jaw, refusing to let the fear show. "You think you're so special, don't you?" he snapped, his frustration boiling over. "You think just because you got lucky in a fight, you can walk around like you own this place." Jason took another step forward, trying to regain control of the situation. "I don't care who you are. I don't care how much money your family has. You're nothing, Luca. Nothing." His voice wavered slightly at the end, betraying the confidence he was trying so hard to hold on to. Luca studied him for a moment, his gaze unwavering. Then he tilted his head slightly, as if observing something under a microscope. "You talk too much." The words were soft, almost amused, but they carried an undeniable weight. Jason stiffened, his hands twitching at his sides. Luca took another step forward, closing the space between them until they were barely a foot apart. Jason's breath was shallow, but he refused to step back. He wouldn't show weakness, not now. But Luca didn't need him to. He had already won. "You're right about one thing," Luca murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't over, but not in the way you think." Before Jason could react, Luca reached into his pocket, pulling out the broken pendant. He held it up for a brief second, letting Jason's gaze lock onto it. Then, without a word, he tucked it away and turned around, walking away for the second time that night. This time, Jason didn't call after him. He didn't move. He just stood there, his face burning with a mixture of shame and something else. Something he had never felt before. Fear. His friends lingered awkwardly before slowly dispersing, unsure whether to follow him or pretend this never happened. Jason clenched his fists once more, but this time it wasn't anger that flooded his veins. It was helplessness. And deep down, in the pit of his stomach, he knew he had messed with the wrong person. Jason stood in the alley long after Luca had disappeared, his body tense, his mind racing. The weight of humiliation pressed down on him, suffocating, inescapable. His gang had already scattered, each of them too ashamed to speak, too afraid to acknowledge what had just happened. Jason had spent years making sure everyone feared him, ensuring that no one ever dared to challenge his authority. But tonight, everything had changed. Luca hadn't just beaten him, he had shattered his image, exposed him for what he truly was. And the worst part? Luca hadn't even needed to try. Jason clenched his fists, his nails digging into his skin. His breath came in short, shallow bursts, as his mind replayed the scene over and over. He couldn't accept it. He wouldn't accept it. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. But as much as he tried to convince himself deep down, an unsettling truth settled in his gut like a rock. He had messed with the wrong person. The next morning, Jason walked into school with a forced smirk, determined to reclaim his reputation. He wasn't going to let a single bad night ruin him. He had spent years building his power, and he wasn't about to let Luca take it away. But as soon as he entered the hallway, he knew something had shifted. The usual whispers followed him, but they weren't the kind he was used to. Instead of admiration or intimidation, there was something else, pity. People weren't scared of him anymore. They were talking about last night, about how he had been beaten, humiliated, controlled. He caught a few students staring at him before quickly looking away, as if they didn't want to make eye contact. His stomach twisted. This wasn't right. This wasn't him. He was supposed to be the one in control, not the one being whispered about. As he walked toward his locker, a voice stopped him in his tracks. "You look a little stressed, Jason." Luca. Jason's jaw clenched as he turned, forcing himself to keep his expression neutral. Luca leaned casually against a row of lockers, his posture relaxed, unaffected. He wasn't smug, he wasn't gloating, he was just there, existing, without a care in the world. And somehow, that made Jason's blood boil even more. "Something on your mind?" Luca continued, his tone calm, unreadable. Jason wanted to say something, to come up with a cutting remark that would shift the power back into his hands. But for the first time he found himself at a loss for words. No matter what he said, nothing would change what had already happened. Luca had won. Jason exhaled sharply, shoving past him without another word. He needed to regain control, to remind everyone who he was. He spotted one of his usual targets, Daniel, a quiet kid who always kept to himself. Without hesitation, Jason reached out and smacked the books out of Daniel's hands, watching as they scattered across the floor. The hallway went silent. Normally, this was the part where people laughed, where Jason reestablished his dominance. But no one laughed. No one even moved. Jason frowned, suddenly aware of the weight of the silence pressing down on him. And then slowly, Daniel bent down, picked up his books, and without looking at Jason, walked away. Jason's chest tightened. He turned, scanning the hallway, expecting someone, anyone, to acknowledge him, to remind him that he was still in control. But instead, he saw their expressions. Some were indifferent, some disappointed. Others were watching Luca. He wasn't saying anything, wasn't doing anything, but his presence alone was enough. Jason had spent years building his empire, but in one night, Luca had torn it all down without even trying. For the first time in his life, Jason felt small, and as he stood there in the middle of a crowd that no longer feared him, he realized the bitter truth. He hadn't lost a fight. He had lost everything. Jason stood frozen in the middle of the hallway, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. The silence around him was deafening. He had spent years ruling this school through intimidation, but now no one feared him. No one even acknowledged his attempt to reclaim control. Instead, they had all moved on. The students weren't looking at him anymore. They were looking at Luca. Jason had tried to humiliate someone he thought was beneath him, someone who had refused to fight back for weeks. But now he understood. Luca wasn't weak. He wasn't scared. He was just waiting. And when the time came, he had shown Jason exactly why he should have never been challenged. The weight of the realization settled in Jason's chest like a heavy stone. He had lost more than a fight. He had lost his power, his status, the very identity he had built for himself. Luca, meanwhile, had never wanted any of this. He never asked to be involved in school drama, never cared about popularity, and certainly never wanted to be the center of attention. But life had a way of pulling him into the very things he tried to avoid. As he leaned against his locker, he watched Jason, noticing the way his shoulders were slightly hunched, the way his eyes darted around, searching for someone to validate him. It was strange, watching the once feared bully look so lost. Luca had been raised in a world where power meant control, where respect wasn't given but earned. His father had always told him, "You don't win by proving you're stronger. You win by making them realize they never stood a chance." And that's exactly what had happened. He hadn't needed to beat Jason down, hadn't needed to threaten him. All he had done was show him what real power looked like. Control, restraint. the ability to walk away knowing you could destroy someone but choosing not to. Jason felt it, that overwhelming sense of defeat creeping into every part of him. He had spent so much time making others feel small, and now, for the first time, he was the one who felt insignificant. He knew that things would never go back to the way they were. Even if he tried to act tough, even if he tried to rebuild his reputation, it wouldn't work. The illusion of his dominance had been shattered, and once fear was gone, there was nothing left. As he turned to walk away, his steps slower, less confident than before, he felt something he had never experienced before: regret. He had bullied people because it made him feel powerful, but now he wondered, had he ever really been powerful? Or had he just been feeding off the fear of others? Luca hadn't needed fear to win. He had something stronger. The next few days at school were different. Jason no longer walked the halls with his usual arrogance. He didn't shove people aside, didn't demand attention. He simply existed in the background, no longer the center of power. Some students still avoided him out of habit, but others saw what had happened and treated him with indifference. Luca, on the other hand, continued on as if nothing had changed. He didn't gloat, didn't seek revenge. He had done what needed to be done. That was enough. Ava, watching everything unfold, smiled slightly. "You didn't have to do much, did you?" she asked one afternoon, as she and Luca sat on the school steps. Luca shrugged. Jason destroyed himself. And that was the truth. In the end, power wasn't about fear or control. It was about knowing who you were, standing firm and refusing to let anyone dictate your worth. And Jason? He had learned the hardest lesson of all. When you build your strength on the weakness of others, it only takes one person standing up to you for everything to fall apart. Luca sat on the school steps, the warm afternoon sun casting long shadows over the pavement. Beside him, Ava watched as Jason walked through the halls, quieter than ever, his once dominant presence now reduced to nothing more than a fading memory. The same students who had once laughed at his jokes, who had followed him blindly, now passed by without a second glance. Power, Luca thought, was a fragile thing. Jason had spent years ruling through fear, but now that fear was gone, and with it, his control. Ava nudged Luca slightly, breaking his thoughts. "Do you think people like him can change?" she asked, watching as Jason hesitated at his locker, as if debating whether he even belonged there anymore. Luca exhaled, twirling the broken pendant between his fingers. "People only change if they want to." Jason stood near the lockers, his fingers tracing over the metal doors, his mind heavy with thoughts he had never entertained before. He had always believed strength came from making others feel small, that power was something you took, not something you earned. But Luca had proved him wrong. He had beaten Jason without throwing a single punch, without shouting, without needing to prove himself. Jason's greatest weapon, fear, had been turned against him, and he realized now how hollow it had all been. There was no point in fighting battles you'd already lost. Maybe he couldn't undo the past, couldn't erase the way he had treated people, but he could do something else. He could walk a different path. For the first time, Jason didn't feel like a leader or a ruler. He just felt human. As the final school bell rang, students poured out of the building, their conversations buzzing through the air. Luca pocketed the pendant, standing up alongside Ava. Before walking away, he cast one last glance at Jason, who remained standing by his locker, lost in thought. Maybe Ava was right. Maybe people could change. But whether Jason did or not, it didn't matter to Luca. His father had always taught him that true power wasn't about dominance. It was about knowing when to fight and when to walk away. And Luca had chosen to walk away, leaving behind a lesson Jason would never forget. As he stepped into the sunlit street, he felt nothing but peace. Some battles don't need fists to be won. Some victories come in silence. Do you think Jason deserved a second chance? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping tales. See you in the next one.